So, welcome everybody. We will be starting the session in 3 minutes. I will be handing over to our moderator, Phil. In the meantime, I would like to let you know that the chat will be disabled, but if you have any questions you would like to pose to the panelists, you can pose them in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote questions. Yes, we will be starting in a couple of minutes. So thanks for your patience. So, welcome everybody. I would also like to let you know that we will be recording this session. And it is also now live on YouTube. We will be starting at 1:30 sharp. Bangkok time. So now, welcome everybody to Human Rights in the Digital Era. I will be handing over to our moderator, Phil Bloomer now, who will start the session. Phil?
Thank you, Vanessa. Hi, everybody. First of all, a big thanks to the United Nations for setting up the forum, which is such an important forum at this time. And my name is Phil Bloomer. I'm the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And the topic of today is Human Rights in the Digital Era, Business Respect for Civil and Political Rights in Times of Emergency. We've got 4 great speakers for you, really expert people. We've got Nigat Dad, who's the founder and executive director of Digital Rights Foundation, and is also a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. We also have Apar Gupta, who's the executive director of Internet Freedom Foundation, and Malavika Jayaram, who's the executive director of Digital Asia Hub and faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And we also have Isabel Ebert, who's a research associate at the Institute of Business Ethics at the University of Galen, and also a visiting researcher at the Oxford University's Internet Institute. So I just wanted to say a few words, really just to open the session by saying that really the respect of human rights by business always gets heavily tested in a crisis. The pandemic really presents a major opportunity for digital technology companies to support government action, to protect public health, and therefore also to protect human rights, the rights to health, but also through the test and trace mechanisms, there are opportunities to also respect and promote the civil and political rights of people, their freedom of movement, for instance. But some states are obviously using these, using this crisis to bring in mass surveillance, to bring in censorship, and to use misinformation. So the session today is really looking at what are the responsibilities of companies when governments are pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable under international human rights law. So there's lots of dilemmas to talk about. I hope you'll be very active as participants in the Q&A box. Please put in all your questions. We're going to have about 45 minutes of panelists, and then we'll move straight to another 45 minutes with answering any questions that have come in. So the first question we're going to go to is what are the most pressing business-related human rights abuses that are being caused by digital technologies employed in the context of the pandemic? And I'd like to go first to Malavika for your comments on that, please.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks to Harpreet and everyone else at the UN who's helped to put this great panel together. I think I'll keep my remarks very, very broad, sort of looking at the entire spectrum of digital issues that are affected by COVID. At the Digital Asia Hub, we've been running a webinar series every week called When the Music's Over. And the sort of series outline is about, right now, there's a lot of courage being displayed. There's a lot of camaraderie. People are bonding. People are finding ways to work across digital barriers. But, you know, there's all the clapping for NHS workers, for doctors, for frontline defenders. There's music, there's clangings of pots and pans. And we've been really concerned about what happens when the music stops, right? What happens once the initial euphoria around the ways in which people are connecting, when that dies down, but you're left with surveillance infrastructure that's been assembled, that's extremely hard to dismantle once the crisis is over. And I think certain governments, as well as a lot of companies, seem to follow this line of, you know, never waste a crisis. So the kinds of things that would be egregious, that would be unnecessary and disproportionate from a human rights perspective in a non-crisis scenario, there's almost this sense that everything's up for grabs right now, right? Whether it's trying to affect encryption norms and standards, whether it's, you know, using national security and public health concerns to actually shut down not just speech or assembly, but to actually shut down the internet itself, as we've seen in Kashmir and many other places. And I think the role of companies in this is particularly important. Largely, I think from a very realistic perspective, because people use products and services of companies even more when everything is online. We're not going to work. We're not going to school. Everything has shifted to virtual platforms. And I think the platforms and intermediaries that were already extremely large and powerful have become even more powerful when they're the main source or block between people accessing necessary goods, services, education, welfare, benefits, insurance, medical services, all of the things that you would otherwise do in person. So I think from a civil and political rights and a human rights point of view, I'm really concerned about issues of access, which I think on one hand are very disproportionately deployed. It's great to say that you have education online and different people can access it on their own terms, but if people don't have a laptop or people don't have access to the internet or their data plans are really expensive, there's a whole bunch of people completely being left out of this online paradigm. I think in terms of assembly, protesting, that's been curbed. When you look at education, that has seen effects. When you look at surveillance, whether it's facial recognition of workers inside factories, which companies like Amazon are now saying they'll shut down, which is great. Question whether that's because their technology isn't great enough and it's a nice, graceful way to bow out of this, or whether it's an actual political stand. But I think shutdowns, speech issues, censorship. I mean, even yesterday we saw how Zoom has actually censored a group that has been talking about the Tiananmen protests. So you see how companies have a really big role in moderating what is lawful or legitimate without having to go to a court, without having an injunction, without going through the necessary due process that would require. Also something as simple as payments. My mother in India can't buy a lot of things because she doesn't have a credit card and she can't get one now. Whether it's benefits and welfare that's tied to digital identity, with a lot of people don't have, right? So, and the tracking and surveillance, whether it's complicit in different kinds of political agendas or whether it's absolutely benign, but still leads to targeted advertising and digital redlining and a digital poorhouse being created where certain people benefit from the pandemic and other people are actually even worse off than they were, which is the poor, the marginalized, LGBTQ communities, women who have less access to infrastructure and money, but who actually produce a lot of the revenue from things like microfinance. So I think Finally, I'll say gig workers and migrant workers are also immensely affected by digital technologies deployed, whether they have 0-hour contracts or whether it's because they are doing the invisible work of tagging keywords of what's legitimate content that gets to stay up versus what's hate speech or porn and gets taken down without caring about all the effects on emotional and other affective considerations. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Malika. That was an excellent overview of some of the major issues. Apar, could I come to you for your insights on this one?
Thank you, Phil. There was excellent remarks by Malvika to frame the context of how businesses are responding globally. And coming from my work as well as expertise, which is geographically located in India, given my organization works on the advocacy elements of these issues, let me become a bit granular in my comments. I also rely on certain data side points. So the wide diversity of companies who we see extend from connectivity companies like your internet service provider to the large platforms, and then the much more local startups. And even within this categorization, there are further peculiar incentives for businesses which essentially pose towards maximizing profit or longevity during the pandemic. Given that their cash burn is essentially they're wanting to reduce the cash burn, retain profitability and sustainability. So they're coming at it with the survival mentality. And it's important to understand companies because then we can understand why they're taking specific measures and how they are advancing as well as undermining the human rights goals which are being caused. So the pandemic does represent an opportunity in several cynical ways of gathering more personal data without adequate checks and balances, given that India does not have a data protection law. But let's start with connectivity. Number one, on connectivity, I would just like to mention that India has a very large number of internet users. It's growing on a very fast pace. They're close to 627 million active collections in India. However, there are great disparities along lines of geography, economic ability, caste, and gender in terms of whether that connection actually translates into an actual device. So as per the Sustainable Development Goals, especially during a pandemic, the inability to have good 4G connectivity disables several rights which include remote participation in education, banking, as well as in work. So I think that's a threshold issue from a development perspective, which we should always take into account. And I don't think so enough is being done either by the government or by the companies in subsidizing their plans or by ensuring that disconnections do not happen through voluntary pledges being encouraged. There's no working group also formed. Second, let's just come to platforms. I've noticed platforms have been responding to this essentially from the perspective of checking disinformation around COVID as it's spreading. But it's also very disheartening to see while they are approaching disinformation, which may cause chilling effects, and we can get into it a bit later. But what they're doing, they're actively partnering with government to promote the contact tracing application in India called Arogya Setu. And this not only are the global platforms through which this application is distributed through the Google Play Store or the iOS Store, but also promoting it widely, such as Twitter or Facebook are encouraging certain campaigns around it, promoting it algorithmically, without actually evaluating the concerns voiced by digital rights researchers at a very threshold, which includes there's an absence of an underlying law or a term limit. There's an absence of a data protection framework to come back to it. Now, finally, what are startups? How are the Indian startups approaching it? I think a lot of them are engaging with it in two ways. Picking up from what Malvika said, a lot of them are happening to be in the services sector where they rely on gig workers to effectuate deliveries and supplies, let's say, of takeaway food or delivery of packages. And quite often they are mandating the use of this contact tracing application without actually accounting for whether their workforce will be having the ability to purchase a smartphone, or if discrimination side risks may accrue to it. There have also been reports how gig economy workers are not being extended the full labor law protections. And I think there's fantastic work in development at the International Labour Organization on this at present as well. Finally, just to end, one thing is that local startups have also, just 10 seconds, they are coming up with solutions for, in addition to contact tracing, for restraining like e-pass systems, which is somewhat similar to China. I'll end it here. Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you very much, Apar. And that's just wonderful to get that straight after Malavika in terms of some of the key ways in which that's coming out in a country such as India. Thank you. So, Nia, could I come to you now, please, and just ask you, you're based in Pakistan, but you have a much broader set of insights. Could you give your views for the question?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on a panel, and thanks to Malavika and Upper for setting the foundation of this conversation. I mean, I think I might be repeating the same things that Upper and Malavika have already mentioned, but I think the biggest concern for us, especially in a country like Pakistan, is the pandemic is a challenge, but I think different actors are finding it as an opportunity. And what we are seeing here is I mean, like India, in absence of any data protection framework, the collaboration and partnerships between businesses and the government in terms of contact tracing apps, and even before pandemic, you know, there were concerns time and again have been raised by the digital rights groups around the practices of the businesses, telecom companies, or even international tech giants and their collaborations and data sharing practices with the government. During pandemic, I think it has become more crucial in terms of that the no to little transparency around how they practices are happening behind the doors. Nobody knows how they are sharing this data. There is no accountability and transparency from the government's end in terms of sharing how they have. I mean, at least in India, there is a conversation, and Upper, you can correct me. I mean, there was this maybe, you know, like after so much discussion, you know, like there was this open source around this contact tracing app, I think, if that's correct. But you know, in Pakistan, there was absolutely no, when the app was introduced by the government, people had absolutely no idea. And in a country where you have more than 200 million people and 70% people have access to the mobile phone and devices, 35% people have, we have like internet penetration of 35%. People had absolutely no idea why they are getting calls from the law enforcement agencies or why they are getting calls from the health ministries. And they were getting messages that they might have come across, or they might have come in contact with the COVID positive patients. And these were those people who were actually the relatives and friends of the COVID positive people. And there was this panic among public. So I think the first question is the transparency, and we started raising this with the government, but also I think the businesses, in absence of any local laws that which sort of help us hold them accountable. I think international human rights standards or UN guidelines on business and human rights. I mean, there is little to no implementation in developing countries. The same businesses who have a footprint in the Europe or in the Western world, when they operate in countries like ours, they don't feel that they are accountable to anyone. And I think that's where we feel that during pandemic, the kind of, as Malavika said, the kind of precedent they are setting, I don't know how we'll go back to the little digital rights discourse that we have set in our context. I don't know if we'll have the same kind of discourse or the same kind of small little rights that we have achieved so far. After pandemic is over, I don't know where we'll stand when it comes to digital rights.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's, again, a really important set of insights that are coming through, particularly in countries such as Pakistan, and this fundamental issue about the interpretation of the international human rights standards, particularly the UN guiding principles that the UNDP and others have done so much to promote in many countries. So let me just go finally, but to our last person, Isabel Ebbett. Please, Isabel, could you just give your insights, and then we'll move to the next question, which is much more about, the relationship between states and companies.
Yeah, thank you, Phil, and also thank you to the organizers. This is a really important panel, and I think it's very important to also get these negative and sort of hopefully some positive examples heard. I think maybe looking a little bit onto what goes wrong from inside the company and from a management perspective is that what needs to be overcome is that some managers perceive that they just roll out their business model that they developed in a specific context and universally roll that out across the globe. And obviously, as we have also heard, that leads to a lack of sort of context, of contextuality, means that the political environment is not really taken into account, that sort of cultural factors are lacking, and also the organizational structure from inside the company is not so well adapted to dealing with those issues on the ground. And again, adding to that also sort of this whole socio-technical notion of when you're using technology, because technology is just not something that you put in a setting and it works in each setting the same way, but it's used by people. And again, through that, there's lots of complications and that can arise, but also, of course, opportunities. But I mean, we're sticking now here. What we're unfortunately seeing is sort of digital rights activists being really concerned that COVID might lead to another wave of mass surveillance, such as we are experiencing since 9/11, unfortunately. And I think we have partly touched upon some of the examples. I'd also want to stress something that we've been doing research on, and that is sometimes because it's happening inside companies, not so much on the public eye, but the data that is collected for performance monitoring in human resource management departments is sort of now combined with like normal performance monitoring, whether you're doing your job right, let's say, is now that sort of monitoring is now combined with programs that want to prevent that the virus spreads inside the departments of companies. But you can imagine that if you combine performance monitoring data with health data, you can create quite a toxic mix. And then imagine that data falls in government hands in not so democratic contexts. And we've touched upon this sort of government requests for user data already, which is one of my kind of key focus areas. And historically, we have always seen a trend that when there are national emergencies, government requests for user data, of course, they grow, they peak. And at the same time, as we also heard from Nigad, the transparency and accountability is really lacking of the companies being able to report on that, partly because they don't want to report on these requests, but partly because they're prohibited by local laws to report on these requests. And again, and we will touch upon this probably later, what are sort of some strategies to cope with that. But the essential problem which keeps reoccurring is that the local laws are sort of really conflicting with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and sort of what stance the company should take. And that's really a dilemma situation, which is not so easy to solve. Again, though, there are some areas when it comes, for example, to disinformation and what has happened around COVID disinformation campaigns in Iran, you can clearly see that the companies also fail in recruiting dedicated native speakers who understand the local context again, and then who can properly fact check. Because the way that research from some of my colleagues, Masa Al-Midani and Mona elsewhere has shown is that the way that the disinformation is then framed by the government is sort of a threat by foreigners, and based on the disinformation the government might spot online, even more people are put behind bars. So there's just lots of opportunities for the government to tap into this pandemic and use it as a legitimacy tool to kind of put pressure on companies. And the companies, some of them want to push back, but others are kind of hiding behind this momentum.
Thank you very much. That's great. And thanks also for really stressing those issues about language and localities and the way that that feeds into such, high level relationships between states and companies. So I'd like to move now to the second question, which is, how much room do businesses have to respect civil and political rights when states involve them in their questionable practices in response to the pandemic? And you've already started to just hint at those issues about the lack of safeguards, I think, around data protection and all those other things. And in this respect, what should businesses do then when confronted with the conflicting requirements of the state and the demands of international human rights law, such as the UN Guiding Principles? So with this one, I'd like to go first to Apar, and then I'll go straight to Nigat, and then Isabel, and then Malavika.
Phil, so that's a very broad framing. I would just like certain guidance from you here. What would be useful if you could just give me a bit of guidance here?
Yeah, so perhaps if you could go to India and say, what do you see in India as the ways in which there's opportunities for businesses to really highlight and respond to the UN Guiding Principles and the way in which they're interpreted in terms of their due diligence around data protection, etc., and then how that plays out in that relationship with the state, for instance.
So the issue which we are essentially seeing with the company side responses in India has been of a lack of a regulatory structure which provides them a level of objective guidance for the level of compliance that they need to achieve towards. So the practices which they generally follow are essentially aimed towards protection of what is the most impactful issue which can undermine user trust in the digital transactions which users have with these businesses, which are data breaches. Now, they usually deal with it, and which also does present a level of harm, given that when personal information is divulged in an unauthorized way across public, it poses risks of impersonation, digital fraud, but also, and it applies in a very direct way on people based on their identities and how they are structured as power relationships intersect within that society. So it will impact women of lower caste more than privileged straight upper caste men in India. Now, from what we have seen is that companies have essentially responded by investing more in their IT systems. For instance, one very tangible conversation which we saw initially was, how does remote work happen? And how should we provide for that? Tech companies also had an internal conversation how they should devise remote working and web conferencing tools. But towards the user side data, beyond the statements that they make and the investing and the investments that they make in cybersecurity, I do not think they are very well crystallized process towards human rights. That said, what I have noticed is that companies have, especially from the technology sector, gone broader. They have organized through the use of their platforms migrant relief, given that there has been a tremendous amount of movement of people who have been daily wage earners in India, who are Indians working in Indian metropolitan cities, back to their native spaces due to the lockdowns and the shutdowns in which they had an inability to earn their daily wage. Thereby, they wanted to travel back to their places of home, also to be and reunited with their family. Now, a lot of this relief in terms of food, shelter, transportation has been organized by tech side companies who have responded positively. However, I would say that there there is a tremendous amount of work and partnership which needs to be built around human rights with Indian companies especially. And I think that level of maturity, especially amongst the younger set of founders, and that empathy can be grown with regular conversations as well as challenging them to do better. And I think it will happen over a period of time.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting. And thanks also for highlighting some of those positive examples that, that are coming through, as well as the very significant issues around the inequalities that are playing out and the way companies can respond to those inequalities and their expression. Nigat, can I come to you now for your comments on that?
Yeah, so frankly, I think it's really, I mean, businesses, especially the big businesses, have a lot of leverage to take a stand when it comes to civil and political rights, because they are big businesses and they have a lot of power. I mean, the responsibility is on them to set the standards for compliance. Otherwise, if they bend over backwards to appease to the government's requests, I mean, the way we see in our transparency reports by the social media companies, then honestly, like, there is a little hope for the smaller businesses, you know, because there is no precedent for them to follow the same by the big businesses. And I mean, I have already mentioned about the transparency. I think one thing that I'm seeing now is, and I don't know whether this is the same for other jurisdiction, but I mean, there is this, like, in Pakistan, during COVID, instead of, you know, like the state or the government's relevant institutions should focus on the internet accessibility, as Malavika mentioned. I mean, in Pakistan, we have 70% population living in the rural areas and 30% in the urban area. So there is this huge, massive digital divide. And then there is another layer of digital divide, which is gender digital divide. And what we basically we are witnessing that lots of students, like thousands of students from rural areas and towns, they go to cities to study in universities and colleges, and during lockdown they had to go back to their towns and villages, where the government decided to continue with the online classes. So Pakistan is not a Singapore or any other country where the internet penetration is like really high. So when the online classes were still continued, the students, even in the lockdown, and when the corona was spreading so fast, they had no other option to come out of their homes and protest, that either give us the internet access or, you know, shut down these classes for a while and let us deal with this pandemic. Because, like, everyone is so it's not just the penance, something that is happening for the very first time, at least in our generation, in our previous generations, and people are still figuring out. There is a lot of issues around mental health. And instead of dealing with that internet accessibility and focusing that people have equal access to internet during pandemic, not just the education, but the other things that my fellow panelists have mentioned around the, you know, accessing the economic packages that the government has announced, or, you know, the domestic violence survivors, for instance, you know. So access to all these facilities are very deeply connected to the digital means during lockdown. What basically we saw instead, the government's focus on now pushing for the laws like online harms rules, and following the footprints of the Western world, where, you know, like holding the big companies accountable, but also the companies in the country accountable in terms of their practices and stuff. But at the same time, you know, those rules are while rushing those rules and laws like data protection. I mean, I'm in all for data protection. We have been pushing for this law for the last many years, but is it a good time to push these laws when we cannot even meet you know, in person in consultations? So there is this push of passing these laws, the online harms rules, and one good thing that I have seen is that the companies are thinking themselves as stakeholders. And the government, the very first time, the government has opened up for the public feedback, that these drafts are open for public feedback and people should give us their feedback. So the companies are chiming in, not just in Pakistan, even outside Pakistan. And they are, keeping in mind the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. They're telling the government that where they are wrong in these rules, and what is wrong with the process in terms of consultations. So I think they are raising issue, but I think they need to do more, and they need to set precedent. One last thing I want to say, that in different jurisdictions, there is a real fear for these companies that they might be completely shut down by the governments, because there have been previous instances where the whole platform was shut down, even in Pakistan for 3 years. So the kind of compromises that they make with the government, I think that's where my worry comes, because there is no transparency, how they make compromises, what are the things they agree to, and the real stakeholders, which are the users, they are not aware of what is happening, in between the government and the companies. So again, we sort of come back to the point of transparency.
Thanks very much, Nia. That's really helpful. And I think those insights about the compromises that companies are constantly making in that relationship with the state is fundamental to this. But it's also great to hear about them also playing that role as stakeholders in promoting guiding principles, at least some of them. Isabel, I know you've been looking at these issues around safeguards and data protection, etc., and that very role of the state with the largest companies and their fundamental responsibility is to uphold, not to appease states, as Nigat said. Could you expand on those remarks, please?
Yeah, I think one key difficulty of the current situation is that the government pressure on the companies is extremely high, and at the same time you have this sort of pseudo legitimacy to implement vast measures, and on top of that, we have a lot of uncertainty actually how the virus works. So whichever measures you adopt, the next day, the sort of academic evidence from a medical perspective might look different, and some measures that you took the previous day might no longer be effective. So as you might remember, the sort of first response of many states was to request a lot of data sets from the telecommunications companies in order to sort of measure the broader movements of the population, to see whether and how people gather, if they stay at home or if they sort of are still holding bigger meetings. And sort of we've obviously, with all the lockdowns put in place, we've sort of moved away from this and are sort of moving in a space, thankfully, we're talking about sort of, instead of tracking, we're talking about tracing apps that then would really just, in the ideal case, be decentrally governed and really would only share data if a sort of a passing on of the virus is very, very likely, if an infection was very likely. But then again, imagine developing a tracing app, not having a medical background, but perhaps being more trained in data protection. And it just, this is a space that is moving super, super quick, but often with a lack of sort of interdisciplinary groups working together. But there has been definitely some progress. But definitely, if you're coming from a human rights due diligence standpoint, human rights due diligence usually requires several stages and lots of time, because you want to do your impact assessment and so forth. But now the risk of the virus spreading further is so high that some measures are adopted without having properly thought through. And this has as probably I don't have to tell most of you, this has a really tremendous negative impact on privacy. And privacy really in this whole data ecosystem is such a gateway. It's really a gateway keeper that can protect and sort of also underpins a large range of other human rights. So we're having these, we're seeing these kind of double standards of of governments in the global north pointing at the governments in the global south and saying like, oh yeah, but they're so intrusive in their practices. But at the same time, I mean, there's a lot of the same things and dynamics apply to some of the government decisions made in the global north. So this is really a global issue right now. And some of these progressive practices we have obviously seen have come also due to a lot of pressure from digital rights activists. What is sort of interesting to see that behind the scenes is it seems like that also investors and investor engagement is moving towards this space and trying to change the more intrusive measures to more decentrally governed, more user-friendly ones. But the transparency is still lacking, so again, then we have this massive question mark on privacy and how to sort of ensure that, I mean, there's something that could resemble free, prior, and informed consent, but that's really a big question mark at the moment.
Thanks, that's great, and so interesting to hear that expression of the human rights due diligence issues versus the speed that is being demanded both by the pandemic but also by states. And I think those are, and hearing that issue being, thanks for emphasizing the issue that privacy is that key gatekeeper to broader human rights violations. So Malavika, can I just come to you for your remarks on this question before we go to the final question and then out to Q&A. So do start to put your questions into the Q&A box if you're a participant. Malavika.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I think, I mean, Isabel brought up the word double standards, and I know there are questions around even us using Zoom as a platform for something like this, right? Which is a very complicated, fraught issue because you have long tails, you have network effects, you have all kinds of reasons of quality and latency, and the ability of companies like Zoom to actually fix problems at scale, which smaller decentralized platforms might not. But I think that is certainly a space where we should look at design challenges and how to overcome them and sort of ways that people might want to boycott certain products. But I think rather than dealing only with the question of legal requirements and how companies navigate compliance with them, I think there is so much that companies can do on a design level, whether it's privacy by design, but especially by default, rather than relying on users and pushing the risks onto the least well-off in both information and access terms to actually set their preferences, navigate settings, some of which are so complicated you need a PhD in media systems. I think companies can do this at scale, right? They can deploy certain technological design choices where you just don't collect certain kinds of data, right? Data minimization. You don't share or integrate certain kinds of data. You use decentralized protocols. I think something like even with contact tracing, however, whether you're a fan of it or not, there are protocols like DP3T, which is an alternative to the more centralized privacy invasive forms, where a lot of the data resides on user phones and is only relayed when they prove positive, right? So there are very definitive alternatives that companies can deploy without waiting for legal sort of pushes on that level. They can actually voluntarily adopt a lot of these norms. Another space where I think they could do a lot more is don't make encryption something that you have to pay for, right? Don't have the premium paid for service include encryption end to end, whereas the free version of a particular service like Zoom, oh, sorry, you can't have encryption, right? So I think this freemium to premium spectrum is something that they could relook at if they really want to do something, if they actually want to walk the walk, right? You could use mesh networks. You can do a lot more community level things. You could give away certain types of technology for free, right? You could do more open source. You could use open data ecosystems where people are already very, very clued in. I think also companies have a huge amount of freedom when it comes to deciding which labor laws they want to actually implement, right? If people are forced to go into work even though they're sick because they won't be given free paid leave, right? So if people are forced to come to work and actually be packaging goods and services, which are then sent to other people, which is actually spreading the virus, but they feel they have no option because they don't get time off, that's something companies don't need to be forced by a government to do. They can voluntarily do it, just as they've done with maternity leave and paternity leave and so many other kinds of time off work. Companies could choose not to deploy certain kinds of technologies at all. They could say, we're not doing facial recognition, we're not developing dodgy immunity passports, we're not doing traffic light system to decide who can get into a train or a bus at all, right? That's a space where they can actually make an ethical statement. And I know that's really difficult because, as folks like Brad Smith at Microsoft have often said, that if a company like Microsoft that does at least care about principles to some level, if they don't do it, a less ethical company will step in and actually create an even creepier version of that solution, right? So I recognize that it's very difficult. It's not, opting not to do it creates a space for less ethically minded companies to get in. And I think the other space where companies have a lot of work they can do on a design level is not to rely on consent. We have so much academic work, we have so much empirical evidence for why consent is completely broken, why informed consent is a myth when you're dealing with digitally illiterate or actually illiterate people, but also the sort of, the brain freeze when you're constantly confronted with having to consent your way out of anything you want to use. Even educated people walk their way out of every situation by just clicking yes. And so I think you really need to re-engineer a lot of these things intentionally to actually be human rights preserving and protecting, rather than wait to be remedied from legal systems or actually be forced to comply. And I think my final thought is to actually view human rights as a space for competitive advantage, rather than seeing it as something that you're doing kicking and screaming because you're forced to actually intentionally adopt it up front and to actually compete on it. Apple has done it in certain ways. Other companies have done it, saying we won't collect certain data, we'll keep things, privacy by default. That should really be a space where everyone is competing, and to use COVID as an opportunity to actually push those agendas, to make that the norm. Same as with encryption earlier, the fact that you used encryption marked you as a suspect. You're probably a civil society activist, and if you're a black box, you're a person of suspicion. But if everybody's using encryption, it's no longer something that's remarkable or unique or a matter for suspicion. So similarly, I think if everyone is using it, that makes it so much easier in terms of adoption as well as lack of surveillance.
Thank you, Malika. That was great. Again, some really good answers from all of you. Just so important to get those items out about I love your element of the voluntary adoption of design norms for privacy, and this should be something of competitive advantage to be human rights respecting in the technologies that you're deploying and selling. That's great. So I'm going to come now to the final question, but I want to ask you all to be just a little briefer this time, so we've got more time for the questions and answers. So I'm going to try and keep you to 2 minutes, if I may, because the last question is really, what are the most pressing issues that digital technology companies face in this pandemic? So we've kind of touched on a number of those areas, but the more important one is, what are you and your organization planning to do over this next period, particularly during the pandemic, but also perhaps in this recovery period? I think a lot of the audience would like to hear where they should be thinking strategically about what to do and who to work with on these issues as we both hopefully start to come out of the worst of the pandemic, but then also looking at the recovery phase. So could I go to Nigat first? On that one?
Yeah.
And I'll come to you, Isabel.
Yeah, I think I'll sort of, very contextually, I'll go back to my previous response around regulations and the laws that the government is planning to enact during this pandemic. And I, as a human rights, as a digital rights organization, see our role and the other organization, how to, work through this situation where you are under the lockdown, where you do not have access to the proper resources and working remotely, and at the same time, push back these problematic laws and rules and speak to the other stakeholders. So I think one of the most pressing issue for us right now here in Pakistan is to look into the online harms rules that the government is doing consultation on, look into the data protection bill that they are now trying to enact, and also speak to the companies. Where do they stand? Speak to the businesses in Pakistan. And this, like, we all usually talk about this multi-stakeholder approach, and I think we are just trying to do that pushing, we as digital rights organization push these companies that these standards that are already there. So not just UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but at the same time, I mean, Global Network Initiative GNI has done a very good work and has set principles for these companies and how they can push back. At the same time, Ranking Digital Rights has done a really good work and developed a methodology for companies to I think Malavika was talking about they can sort of like compete in who is the best in terms of following the human rights. And I think RDR, Ranking Digital Rights, sort of give that framework where companies can see that how they can fulfill the human rights standards around freedom of expression and right to.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I do think that that effort now at looking at the systems and the regulations and the way that they're playing out is going to be crucial. And I applaud your idea of actually speaking directly to the companies and trying to advocate directly to them, that they speak directly to the company, to the government, because the states will have to some extent listen to that. That's great. So now I'd like to move to Isabel for your remarks. What will you be working on, and what are your recommendations in terms of strategies going forward?
Yeah, we sort of going back to the point about re-engineering and thinking about to which extent can privacy by default help, and how does it work together with due diligence. My colleagues and I have just written a study for the German Institute for Human Rights, so the German National Human Rights Institution, which then advises the government on policy questions around digital rights and businesses. And in that study, we really argue that human rights due diligence is certainly very relevant for coping with negative impacts on human rights of business activities in the sort of tech sector. At the same time, it is a very specific field, and there's some specific questions that have to be addressed and that are not so clearly yet defined in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And of course, there's now this new project BTEC where OHCHR wants to more clearly define what the UN guiding principles mean for digital technologies. But we have, with that study, at least come up with a couple of proposals how business practices can be adapted in a human rights due diligence way to also more digital business models. And some of the recommendations we give is that businesses sort of really have to think along the whole data life cycle in order to spot certain unintended consequences and sort of mitigate and eradicate them. They need to find the sort of blind spots that might be created through the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence. But again, what I said in the beginning of this panel is the necessity to implement these data models with the local context and the local political context, and also the organizational reality. That really means there needs to be a change in the key management questions. So moving from just applying the data model to a management perception that is collaborative, that integrates the stakeholders, and that also means that might be stakeholders that are not in the organization, in the company, but there might be third parties that are affected by data that users are sharing without their consent. And we're really advocating for data minimization rather than data maximization principles, testing data with workers' councils if they exist, and
Very
really
I'll have to cut you off in a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, last point, really communicate transparently to employees and all other affected stakeholders what sort of data is collected and how it's used.
That's great. And I think that adds very nicely to what Nigat was also pressing on in terms of this multi-stakeholder approach. And it's when we're talking to companies, we can also be talking to them about their own internal practices and the democratization of some of that, as well as their relationship with the state. Malavika, could I come to you now for your final remarks on this before we go out to questions? Just 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of ethics washing, ethics bashing, right? The ethics has become a very pejorative thing. But I think at a time like this, it's a really good opportunity to hold companies' feet to the fire and say, you wasted so much time and energy talking about ethics instead of legally enforceable provisions. So do you want to actually like put your money where your mouth is and actually ramp up your ethics work to actually work across jurisdictions to deal with cross-border issues and to actually address things that are much better dealt with through ethics that are at least seemingly universal relative to local laws and regulations. So I think this is a great space to actually make them accountable to that. I think the other thing I would suggest is to actually work with really unusual allies, right? If you look at something like the US, there are very, very weird alliances where the gun control lobby are people who are really interested in privacy, right? People who really want guns, don't want to be seen to be having guns and buying them. So they're a really weird ally when you want to push privacy norms. So I think, I mean, that's not a great example in itself, but I think there are all kinds of ways in which there are people in this space who've been advocating for things that used to be seen as extremely strange and radical. Now is the time that if you want to do anything really weird and radical, I mean, now is when we're dismantling policing, dismantling capitalism, dismantling everything we've seen as sacred. I think this is the time to actually work across sectors, across disciplines, to come up with really interesting, powerful alliances. I mean, a lot of the discrimination we're seeing now is nothing new to communities who've dealt with it their entire lives, right? Now we're seeing it in the digital arena, but there are people who've seen it offline. So that offline-online spectrum should be further consolidated.
Thank you very much. I think that's very, again, just very strong words around the issue of finding diverse alliances. And people mentioned investors, for instance, previously. Yeah. We've got all these different groups who understand also through the pandemic what the inequality of their positions has meant as well. So bringing that diverse set of alliances to really press for significant and bold change is very helpful. Thank you, Malavika. Apar, to you finally, and then we'll go straight out to questions. If people can start to load their questions in, we'll be grateful, and we'll come straight to you afterwards.
Thanks, Phil. A couple of things we've noticed. A lot of people are spending a lot of time online. So we are focusing on civic education because quite often digital rights is a new area. So the political beliefs and value systems which are being espoused need to be granularly explained. So we use social media very extensively, video explainers very extensively, and the young people are responding very positively. So this bridges the gap, what we call between the public and public policy, increases the power of civil society and digital rights intervention, which then flow into an institutional framework. So we conduct a lot of strategic litigation also, but that's done in an incremental manner. And would just like to re-emphasize as the last point on growing intersectionality, given that technology is impacting all segments of civil society work, from gender to livelihood to now workers' rights and labor. And we've seen it in a recent joint representation sent against the mandatory imposition of the India's contact tracing app, in which if a person did not install it, they are under a potential criminal prosecution and penalty process. So close to 45 groups signed onto it. I would invite more people to check out our work on internetfreedom.in. That is internetfreedom.in. And we are open to collaborations by local and international partners, as well as businesses. Even though we may not align with them, we're always open to a conversation with them and persuading them towards actually helping us advance digital rights. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Okay, so thanks very much for all those. I think we've got some great overviews now in terms of the approaches that can be taken. And so I'll just wait now for a few questions to come in. I think Kevin's going to put them in the chat box. So yeah, so we've got a first question coming, which is quite it's a very important one and quite specific. What are the responsibilities of developers of contact tracing apps? So those developers that are really developing those contact tracing apps, what responsibilities do they have in the way in which they lend that technology or sell that technology to states in particular, and perhaps to other companies? Isabel, I know you've been looking at this specifically, I think. Do you have any initial remarks on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's about the governance of those apps. So let's say the government decides to go for a certain provider and then sort of buys the technology. And then, well, that's how, with every product you buy, you don't really completely know what went into it and how it will work in practice, let's say. And in every state where you then use that technology, it is of course adapted to the context. And if you sell, and these I mean, some of these technologies can be really invasive, and selling that to some governments might as such be a decision that you have taken, and that has again a human rights impact. And so that's the one thing, deciding that you sell to a certain government that might have a really bad human rights record. And then in the deployment stage, you really have to make sure that the government decides about the sort of risk it's going to take, that the government needs to know what are the weak spots of that technology. Has there been maybe in the testing stage an area of application that has been particularly problematic, and really point to some of the unintended consequences that might occur. I mean, I can only say that in a very abstract way, because of course it really depends where it's employed. But if you compare across countries, government have really opted for very different ways of those tracing apps. And so far, I mean, that's something we really have to be in mind, how effective the apps have been in really combating the virus isn't really academically proven yet. And there have been a lot of adverse impacts in South Korea, for example, and there are statements by the South Korean National Human Rights Institution on that. So yeah, but perhaps it would be nice to hear a little bit more from the other panelists also, what they have been seeing in their context.
Thanks very much. I think that's very helpful in terms of, you know, they have a responsibility to choose where they will allow these apps to be used, and they also have the responsibility to ensure that due diligence is done in the local context, knowing where the high risk groups are, etc. Anybody? We don't need everybody to come in on every question, but anybody else like to come in on that one, on the tracing apps responsibilities? Malavika, I see you leaning forward.
Oh, I was just going to say very quickly that in our When the Music's Over series, we have one this evening, which is actually on South Korea, the UK and Australia, all of whom have come up with legislation for safeguards around COVID tracing apps and immunity passports. So it's KS Park from OpenNet Korea talking about the South Korean situation that emerged after MERS and SARS, and how they already had legal provisions and how they've been used in quite egregious ways, which I think also speaks to one of the questions about, you know, the surveillance of the one person who was infected and went to all the gay nightclubs, and now it's turned into homophobic outbreaks as well. And then we also have Lillian Edwards, who was the lead author of the coronavirus safeguards bill that was debated before the UK Parliament, and Graham Greenleaf, who's a privacy institution all by himself, who's commenting on Australia's legislation. So if people are interested, I'll just put the link in and you can dial in this evening, well, in a few hours, where we'll be speaking about the legislative safeguards around tracing apps.
Fantastic, that's great. A lot there in terms of the South Korean, UK and Australia laws. Okay, should we move to the next question? Anybody else? Oh, Appar, do you want to just come in?
Sure. India has a very strange position with regard to contact tracing, where it's adopted maximization model at the federal level, and there are also state level apps which are there. There's a high degree of uncertainty. They are building towards additional functionality of immunity, not only immunity passports, but also determination, which is algorithmically defined in terms of COVID status, which is not manual contact tracing by itself. So it goes beyond, I would say, traditional COVID tracing apps per se. So it's not only tracing, it's determination now. And we've done quite a extensive amount of work on it, not only on its mandatory imposition, but my colleague Siddharth Dev has written extensive working paper, which is in the process of being updated with comparative studies from the Trace Together app, as well as MIT, the SafeKit app. So I'll put in that link as well. And of course, India doesn't have any underlying legislation. So I do look forward to my colleague, at least Siddharth Dev, joining that lecture in the evening and discovering what can be learnings which we can take away towards creating a legal safeguards in India around contact tracing, given the amount of investment the government is making in terms of digital being the primary method of with questionable efficacy. But even then, how do we bring in those safeguards through legislation?
Yeah. Very good. Okay, I'm going to move us on. The next question is, what role should telecommunications providers play in respecting human rights? For instance, Zoom recently shut down a user account that hosted a Tiananmen Square commemoration. Nigat, would you like to come in on that one first?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, sorry. What role should telecommunications providers play and platforms, I think, as well, play in respecting human rights? For instance, Zoom recently shut down a user account that hosted a Tiananmen Square commemoration.
Right. So I think it's, I mean, I think we have already discussed that in a jurisdiction where, you know, you don't have laws or regulations in which the while like during the drafting of those legislation, the human rights were not part of or were not center of the stage. I think if those legislations are there, then telecom companies or these or even internet service providers, you know, they are not really accountable, or no one can hold them accountable, because I'll talk about the local laws, because like under the local laws, what we have seen that they are also threatened of, you know, their license being terminated under the local laws if they do not you know, abide by the direction of the regulatory body. So if the regulatory body sends them the notification of shutting down particular thing during this time period, we have seen, by the way, this in Pakistan as well, and people can look up to our website where, you know, there was this international conference of political descendants online was happening, and the Zoom was not available during that particular time period in Pakistan. And how did that happen? So we work with the international organization called NetBlocks, and quickly did the scan that on what networks Zoom is not available at the moment, and we found that almost all telecom networks providing internet or internet service providers, Zoom was not available at that particular time for few hours in Pakistan. So it coincided with that particular conference which was happening outside Pakistan. So I think they're like these issues that we are still grappling with, where, you know, like digital rights activists like us, but also people who are illiterate, like Malavika said, who absolutely have no idea that they have actually rights that exist for the online space as well, and equally apply on online and offline. So I think if there like more awareness where people can question that why this was banned, they can question the companies, ISPs, telecoms, at the same time the government. And we produced a small report, the NetBlocks produced a small report that why Zoom was blocked. So we can also question Zoom as well, that your services were blocked in Pakistan, how that happened. So I think they're like these things that need to consider, but at the same time, the existing laws around licensing are really, really problematic. And that's where the fair and threat comes goes to the small companies or telecom companies within that particular jurisdiction.
Thanks very much. That's very clear. Anybody else like to come in on this one? Please, Isabel.
I think just one point to add, and I fully agree to all that Nigat said. It's just also, I mean, there are incidents where the staff of the telecommunications companies has been really threatened, as in threatening physical harm. And of course, that's something where also the company, in case of doubt, has to take a stance and of course protect their people on the ground. I just wanted to show these incidences. You can see also some stuff when in the reports by the Global Network Initiative, when they release their reports on sort of adverse cases, and as some of those incidents have been documented.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question now. There's a related question here, which is how best to combat fake news and disinformation. So this is obviously one that's important for Nigat with the Facebook Oversight Board. But you came in first last time, so I'll give you just a moment to think about that. Anybody else like to come in on that, the whole issue about misinformation and how to deal with it? Please, Apar.
So I'll start with what we should not do. We should not criminalize it in an overbroad manner. And that's an easy one. I just wanted to check mark. Because governments are doing it. They're using prohibitory laws. And quite often what happens in enforcement frameworks on the level of small districts is that the prosecution quite often falls to a public official who, again, goes with the systemic bias towards prosecuting people who do lack social power again. So quite often people who dissent, people who shine a great amount of transparency, much needed things in the times of a pandemic, given the total restriction on civil liberties, they face the prosecution, which may or may not come with malicious intent, but the prosecution itself has a enormous and tremendous chilling effect. So just going with what a lot of what David K has said, let us not criminalize. We should look at a much more comprehensive toolkit. And of course, Nigat's the expert here. So I'll just stop.
Thank you very much. That's a very good thing about what not to do. Action as inaction. I think that's great. Nigat, please, to you.
First of all, Upper, I'm not an expert. Please don't put me on the spot. I think this is the issue that we all are grappling with. I mean, I completely agree with you around the criminalization of where we are seeing the governments are going, not just the governments in the global south, but also like the Western world. The way they are setting these precedents are really, really bad for the developing countries. And as far as the tech giants are concerned, I think they have done a little bit of work around dealing with disinformation and misinformation around COVID. But I think given the enormous amount of profits that they get from our data, I think they can do much more than what they are doing right now. As far as the oversight board is concerned, I think the oversight board is looking into operationalizing itself, and we'll look into more into these issues around content moderation. But at the same time, we'll look into the cases which will impact the larger societies. And of course, we know that a very important elections are coming up in November in US, and then other elections in other jurisdictions. So I'm really excited to see that how we can make a change as an oversight board.
Very good. Well, I'm sure lots of us are wishing you well in that work. There's going to be a whole set of dilemmas coming through. Malavika, Isabel, would you like to just come in on this issue of misinformation? Please, Malavika.
Very quickly, I think this is a good time to also test the limits of legislation in this regard. A lot of governments have actually come up with legislation, like Singapore and other countries, specifically targeting fake news, and I'm using the word very broadly, even though I dislike it, because there are different, misinformation, disinformation, they all have completely different attributes and characteristics, but they're used very bluntly. But I think some of these have been very blunt instruments, and I think observing and doing a lot of empirical research around overreach and around the limits of some of these legal instruments, I think this is a really great time to be doing that. And I think a lot of hope has been placed on fact-checking organizations, but a lot of the research shows that it's a tiny drop in the ocean relative to the deluge of misinformation. So I think also looking at, return on investment is a terrible term, but I mean that in a human rights sense, like what is the actual impact of a lot of fact-checking? Is it too little, too late? Are there better safeguards that you can have at the level of infrastructure that companies should be doing, rather than tagging or elevating or downvoting after the fact?
Very
and I
good.
think all of the discussions around Section 230 CDA in the US are something that everybody should be keeping note of, to look at what that might mean after Trump's executive order. What does that mean for the liability of companies in this regard?
Yeah, excellent. Any final remark from you, Isabel, before we move to the next question?
We had one comment also on the German hate speech law and sort of the difference to the US context. And I think I want to just add something, and really echo Malavika as well. Sort of the track record of the German hate speech law has been mixed, and it has also been partly used against also public statements on social media of human rights defenders. So I think we really have to be looking very carefully. At the same time, of course, the historical context is very different to the US, where in the US you prioritize freedom of speech, versus in Germany, due to its history, you're much quicker in shutting down certain statements in public. So maybe just to answer also that question that came up in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's great. Very important to talk about those different historical precedents that set different cultures and different responsibilities. It's great. So I'll move on to we've got two more questions, I think. And then we'll start to close. So if anybody's got an urgent question, please put it in now. The next one is, we just got another. So we've got one which is about internet shutdowns, and what are the strategies that civil society can use when there are internet shutdowns. So what are your recommendations in countries where states like in Myanmar simply close the internet? What are the ways in which you would recommend civil society and indeed companies and investors start to think about the ways in which they can approach that? And then the other one is the broader issue about human rights impact assessments during the pandemic. So, can somebody also just describe what you're seeing in terms of digital technology, go a little deeper on the human rights due diligence and impact assessments that you started to see as the core framework, perhaps, for that digital for that due diligence. So, who'd like to take the shot? Yes, Nigat, please, and then Apar.
Yeah, so on internet shutdowns, I think there are like two things that can be done, and in the past some of the instances were really successful. One is strategic litigation, and I think it's really important. Not just like globally when internet shutdowns happen. We see in our jurisdiction that there's always this narrative of national security that is being used to shut down internet, and how the state or the people who are responsible to shut down internet, how they define such a broader term. And I think that's where we have seen in Pakistan, and Appa will talk about in India, but in Pakistan we have seen that people have gone to the high courts and challenged those decisions, especially in the areas where the government thinks that these are the areas where the conflict is going on, or these are sensitive areas for the national security. And at least the strategic litigation started a discourse that the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, some of the progressive judges really interpreted them in a very, very good way. So they ordered the regulatory bodies and also the Ministry of IT to come and respond in the court that why these shutdowns are taking place again and again. And when I spoke about the students who are now deprived of taking online classes, it's because of internet accessibility, at the same time the shutdowns that are happening for the last many years. So I think it's strategic litigation is one thing, but in the past we have also seen the economic argument. When the companies use economic argument, I think that's also something that we have seen in Pakistan. The one telecom company went to the high court against these shutdowns, and how this was impacting them as a financial loss. So I think that these ways that the companies and the individuals can sort of chime in and invoke the laws that are already there, or the constitutional fundamental
Thank you.
rights.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So just quick answers on either of those from anyone, particularly the due diligence, Apar.
So very quickly, for our friends in Myanmar and to supplement Nigar, one thing you can do is, if you have a chamber of commerce, you can activate that to issue statements towards the public authority when the internet shutdown happens. That usually insulates individual businesses and has proven to be effective. The second is you can push towards greater transparency as a threshold argument rather than challenging the shutdowns itself, which brings a higher degree of scrutiny and then activates the second and third level legal challenges. And finally, appeal to a greater sense of civic empathy by broad basing your demands in public communications, by saying that this can happen to you tomorrow, especially during the time of the COVID pandemic. At Nigar just illustrated, telemedicine, distance education, those are very powerful arguments to granularly build towards. So I just had these specific recommendations for our friends in Myanmar. All the best. I hope you prevail on this. This is an issue plaguing all of us in South Asia.
Thank you very much, Apar. I think that's great. And so you've got these approaches of strategic litigation. You've got that issue of also finding new alliances, using the chambers of commerce who will be equally affected, for instance, but also that appeal out. I think that's very important to the public, using a narrative that the public will understand about what the impacts of this are. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Anybody want to take up the due diligence issue before I come back to you for your final short remarks? Isabel, do you want to just say a quick word on that?
Yeah, as I said before, again, the problem is this moves, the current situation moves so fast, and some of the government orders or requests or whatsoever demands might come in with a really tight timeline. And so in the space of government requests for user data, this happens, it has happened even before the pandemic in these ways. And some of the more progressive companies sort of have really governance practices in place that assures that there's somebody, or like at least ideally an interdisciplinary panel assessing such demands within 24 hours. And they're also available around those 24 hours. So in different time zones, different locations, and really looking at those demands in a way that ensures that it's not just a legal compliance practice, but it has a human rights expert on board. So that's something that needs to be available. Yeah,
so important. Very good. I think that's a great addition to the due diligence remarks that were made earlier. So now I'm going to just go back to the panel and ask you for your final remarks. Literally, if you could just do it in less than 2 minutes and a minute and a half. I'm going to be strict because otherwise we have to close in 8 minutes, and there's and so you'll just stop other people speaking. So can I go first to Apar?
I wouldn't take up any time. I think I've said enough. And I just hope that these challenges which we are facing together, there's this sense of solidarity, and even when the music stops, we are still holding hands and we keep dancing together. So I know it's taking a tremendous amount of energy from all of us to keep persevering in civil society. I'm just leaving this with a message of hope beyond hope, and despite our present circumstance. Things are tough. I think we'll prevail if we keep talking with each other.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to hear. Isabel, over to you, and then I'll come to you, Nigat, if I may.
Yeah, I also think this is an excellent example where now the multinational platforms and telecommunications companies can really step up for their human rights commitments and really show that they have adapted their management practices, but they need to show it now.
Great. Coming back to that issue of competitive advantage as well, I think is fantastic. Nigat, to you, please.
Yeah, I just want to say that during lockdown, our brains are not locked, and we are keeping eyes on companies and governments. So we are watching you guys. Whatever you are doing, we'll rise, and we'll resist. So I just want to say that no matter we are going through a lot of tough times right now, but definitely we keep coming back with our suggestions and feedbacks and comments, and be part of the online meetings.
That's great. Thank you. And Malavika, to you.
Two very quick things. One is that, the UN guiding principles and all of these norms apply regardless of size of the enterprise. But of course, the smaller you are, the harder it is to devote funds towards things like human rights impact assessments or due diligence or other kinds of things, which a bigger company can bear more easily. But the big companies often use that as an argument to say, oh, maybe Twitter could comply with these horrible laws, but look at all the small companies. So I think it's a great opportunity for big companies to actually create a coalition of the willing with all the little companies to actually band together to protest against very egregious requirements from governments, using that size argument, saying, different companies according to size and income have a very different ability to comply with demands of, handing over data or complying with things. So I think that could be a really good feature rather than a bug. And I think finally, we're all of us on this, most of us on this panel have always dealt with visas and other issues that have prevented us from having access to seats at the table, to where these conversations take place, to travel to conferences and other things. And I think even though we all have Zoom fatigue, to use this crisis as an opportunity to actually really genuinely create diverse voices and to really improve the breadth and the range of issues that we're all engaged in, because if we can't do it now, we're never going to be able to do it, right? When travel comes back into our lives, we'll have the same issues all over again, just to really not just flatten the curve, but flatten the world when it comes to these kinds of conversations and to really promote access. I think this is a great opportunity to do that and to piggyback onto efforts to do it for business reasons. Let's also do it for human rights reasons.
Fantastic. Thanks to all four of you. Those were great final remarks. I think we've had a wonderful session together. I hope everybody's, the participants have found it equally stimulating. I think from my point of view, I'd just say a few final remarks. I think being alert to that first remark of Malavika's about, what is happening in the digital infrastructure is fundamentally important at the moment, because it will be hard to dismantle later. So we have to be alert to what is happening. I think we've also heard so much about the way the inequalities of our own societies are being exposed and exacerbated, including in the digital spheres, and that there are therefore opportunities to address them in a more coherent way and to do that together. I think we've also heard about the key safeguards and the key due diligences that we need to be speaking to states and companies about. And we've also heard about the importance of adapting the approaches to the different contexts and the different languages that there are around the world, and that extraordinary diversity which we have as humanity. I think the other things I'd say is that we've heard very much that big business in this sphere makes a lot of money and therefore can afford to do much more of the right thing rather than the wrong thing, and that they should be upholding their responsibilities on international human rights and not simply appeasing states. And we have to be alert to the compromises, and they will make much more compromises if they don't hear from civil society. If it's all one way in terms of the state demanding more and more from them, and there's no counterbalancing voice from civil society, inevitably those compromises will be further towards the end of our privacies and freedoms of expression. The other thing I think you've heard very strongly is this issue around really working on collective action in terms of diverse alliances. We've heard a lot about actually speaking to chambers of commerce, speaking to the companies, trying to get them on board in terms of speaking with states, but also clearly with that broader section of diverse civil society that's out there. And that collective action, I think, between the large companies and the small companies too, is going to be fundamental. I think we've also heard about that need to press companies to really adopt design norms that enhance people's privacy, and to not simply start to monetize issues such as privacy through encryption. And then finally, I think we've heard very strongly in these final remarks that we need to be bold. This is the time to be bold, particularly in terms of the pandemic and the recovery. And there's opportunities now. And I think the final remarks were so inspiring in terms of just giving that sense of real hope. You know, it's easy to despair in these times, but this is an extraordinary tragedy. But this tragedy is also an opportunity to reset some of the norms. And so there's an opportunity for all of us to do that together. With that, I just want to thank very much the panelists, to Malavika, to Apar Nigat, and to Isabel. I want to thank the United Nations, and particularly the UN Development Programme and Harpreet, who worked so hard to make this happen. To Kevin, who's been our wonderful, Kevin and Vanessa, who've made this possible technologically. And finally, to you as participants for coming on. Thanks ever so much, everybody, and go well. Bye-bye.